The risk management discipline has published many bodies of knowledge that document what organizations must do to manage risk. One of the best known sources is the ISO 31000 standard, Risk Management Guidelines, developed by the International Organization for Standardizations, a standard body commonly known as ISO. ISO's 5-step risk management process comprises the following and can be used by any type of entity. Identify the risks, analyze the likelihood and impact of each, prioritize risk based on objectives, treat or respond to the risk conditions, monitor results and use those to adjust as necessary. While these steps are straightforward, everyone has unique factors that affect how it should manage and monitor risk. To determine and apply those factors, it is helpful to apply a risk management framework as a part of a comprehensive approach to planning, executing, and tracking overall management of the various risks. It's also important to keep in mind that the goal of the risk management process, in the context of a broad framework, is not to completely eliminate all risk, but to determine acceptable levels of risk given your objectives and then work to keep those risk factors within agreed upon boundaries. The steps below will help determine and apply specific actions to do so. Today we check how identify risks. The first step is to determine the potential risks themselves. That requires some context. To consider what could go wrong, one needs to begin with what must go right. Begin the process with the review of your objectives and the various resources or assets that enable them. Risk practitioners often apply a top-down, bottom-up approach to thinking about what might impede those objectives. The top-down portion considers mission-critical programs that should not be impaired, like sales transactions in a retail store or manufacturing process in a factory. It then lists the conditions that might impair those programs. For the bottom-up portion, one can consider various known threat sources, like earthquakes, ransomware attacks, or economic downturns, and ponder what impact those might have. Because risk is, by definition, any uncertainty that affects objectives, a risk is only a risk if it has impact. The more impactful a risk is, the higher the priority. The analysis of that priority will occur in the next step, but first one needs to consider the various risk factors to create a scenario that can be measured. The following 4 elements are necessary to be present to describe a negative risk. A valuable asset or resource that would be impacted, a source of threatening action that would act against that asset, a pre-existing condition or vulnerability that enables that threat source to act, some harmful impact that occurs from the threat source exploiting that vulnerability. With these building blocks, one can compose a broad set of risk scenarios to be analyzed, sorted, and treated. Describing the risk as a scenario helps with communicating the risk conditions and analyzing the likelihood and impact of the risk. It also makes it easier to consider how to respond. An example scenario might be the manufacturing plant is affected by a power outage resulting from a tropical storm, disrupting plant operations for several days. Attributes of a negative risk. While hindsight is never perfect, it provides useful insight into what the risk events might occur in the future. In particular, it can be helpful to review headlines about risks that similar businesses have faced, the conditions that enabled them, and how the risks impacted the organizations. Risk categories. In considering various types of risks, it may be helpful to organize them into categories. That categorization enables each type of risk to be considered and tracked by individuals or teams that are familiar with particular topics. For example, risk can be organized into the following 4 areas: strategic risk, such as reputation, customer relations, technical innovation; financial and reporting risk, example, market, tax, credit; compliance and governance risk, example, ethics, regulatory, international trade, and privacy; and operational risk, example, information and technology security and privacy, supply chain, labor issues, natural disasters. Categories of risks also help integrate information as managers communicate about, track and adjust risk response. For each risk category, an intentional process for developing the scenarios will ensure that the list is sufficiently comprehensive. Many tools are available to help visualize and evaluate these scenarios. Examples include risk breakdown structures for project risks. Example: use a risk breakdown structure RBS to understand your risks. Threat trees for cybersecurity risk, such as Carnegie Mellon Octave Allegro methodology. Delphi exercise for considering investment risk. The final component of this first step, risk identification, is to record the findings in a risk register. The risk register provides a means of communicating and tracking the various risks throughout subsequent steps.